Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. Today we're going to deviate a little bit from the news and celebrate this time of year by doing a deep dive conversation with multi-platform producer Heather Leah. Heather, I know this is one of your favorite topics and it's one of my favorite topics, so let's dive right in. It feels like North Carolina, I don't know what it is, but it feels like we have more ghost stories here, more haunted places than they do in other states. I mean, is that true or does it just feel like that?
I think North Carolina, part of the reason we have a lot of ghost stories is because ghost stories come from legend and folklore. And there is folklore, we have so many different cultural origins of our folklore, right? We have the coast, where we have stories that relate to pirates and ghost ships and even mermaids. And then we have the mountains, where we have folklore that relates to fairies. There's kind of something for everyone all across the state. So you've got ghost stories that really have a wide variety. And in Appalachia in particular, you've got a lot of these oral traditions that were passed down. And I think that's where a lot of our ghost legends begin.
And I know you love history. And so many of these stories come from history. They come from actual real stories of real things that happened in our state. And then people, take that history and they add in kind of this extra layer of these ghost stories. How does history play a role?
Oh gosh. Well, so I'll give you an example. We have a ghost story that was very popular called the story of Acid Park, right? And this was a tale that is kind of based out of the Wilson area of North Carolina. And the history is that there was a man who created these. You've seen them, the whirligigs in Wilson, right? He created these whirligigs. He started building them in World War II when he was actually serving in the military, and he built them over his farm. And you could go and see these huge, unusual whirligigs on his farm. However, as he got older and they started to not be cared, as cared for because he was no longer able to, they started to get really overgrown. And if you drive out there today, you can still see kind of the skeletons of some of these whirligigs rusting away out just kind of on the side of the road. When you come around this corner on the road, there's this really sharp curve. You'll see these whirligigs just hit you out of nowhere. Well, obviously legends started to spring up around these, right? People started to come up with this story that his daughter had died in an accident, a tragic drunk driving accident where someone hit her, and that he had pulled apart her car to make the whirligigs, and that when you came around the curve, you'd see this sparkling, dazzling light show, and they called it Acid Park, and they believed that had to do with a car accident and a tragic death. Well, his daughter is very much alive. There was no crash. But if you go out there, you will see these old rusting skeletons of whirligigs, and there is a crashed car on the side of the road just rusting away. I suspect that there probably was an accident out there at some point, and someone started telling a story about this accident was caused. It's related to the whirligigs, and it just kind of spins from there.
Gotcha. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Like you said, it's kind of a whisper down the lane thing. People just take a part of something that's true and then they add on to it, whatever they're hearing from other people. So, are some of these stories more credible than others? In other words, are there some that you can't disprove because so many people have witnessed it or believe that it's actually true?
Yeah, so a really interesting one that I researched last year was Lydia's Bridge. Now, Lydia's Bridge is in Jamestown, North Carolina, and a lot of historians have been trying to figure out if Lydia was a real person. The story behind Lydia's Bridge is from back in the 1920s, they built this bridge that would let you go underneath the train tracks, right? But eventually that bridge was put out of commission and there's a new bridge right beside it. So that bridge just got really overgrown. It got spray painted. It became this creepy old railroad tunnel off to the side of the road. At some points in old photos, you can't even see Lydia's Bridge anymore. It's so overgrown. You would have to dig through all the woods to find this creepy old tunnel bridge. Well, of course, people made a ghost story about it. And the ghost story of Lydia's Bridge It's your traditional phantom hitchhiker story. Most states, I think, have a story like this, right? That if you drive past Lydia's Bridge at night, you'll see a woman in a ghostly white dress and she'll hitchhike. And if you take her into your car, she'll tell you her address in High Point. And if you take her to her home in High Point, when you get out of your car and go to let her out her passenger door, she won't be there. And then if you go knock on her door, her mother will answer the door and you'll say, the other person will say, "Did Lydia come in?" And of course, the mother will say, "Lydia's been dead for 30 years." And that's the ghost story. However, so you can see where this story would come from, a creepy old bridge abandoned on the side of the road. Uh, Historians wanted to determine, was there really a car crash there in the 1930s or late 20s that could have spun up this story, and was there a Lydia? And they actually did find that there was a tragic car crash that killed a woman who was about 30 years old, who lived in High Point and was working in the Jamestown area and had a crash that night. And her name was not Lydia, but her middle initial was L, and they actually found her grave. It's she's buried out in a cemetery out there. So I think that these stories are
Fascinating.
based. Yeah, there is a history to these stories, and a lot of them are based on something real.
Absolutely. We're going to talk more in detail about some of your favorites after the break, but can you just name a few? What are your top? Do you have a top list for haunted places, or is that hard?
It's hard, but I can name a few. The Devil's Tramping Ground. It fascinates me because there is no explanation, and that Devil's Tramping Ground has been around for hundreds of years. Even the tribes that lived in that area had legends about that land, and I think that's so mysterious that for hundreds of years, people have been afraid of this area of land that won't grow anything.
And where is that?
Devil's Tramping Ground is in Chatham County, and I've done a lot of research into the history of that.
Right.
I also love the story of buried treasure hidden in Cary, off High House Road. There's also a ghost story related to an underground speakeasy hidden beneath Fayetteville Street. So those are some of my favorites.
Those are all really interesting. Well, you are listening to the WRAL Daily Download. We're going to be back in a few minutes with Heather after the break, and she's going to give us a sneak peek behind some of these stories. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm speaking with Heather Leah about haunted places in North Carolina. Okay, so you just told us right before the break some of your favorites. Why is it's the Devil's Tramping Ground? Is that what you call it? Okay, in Chatham County. Have you been there? And just give us a sense of what it's all about, what it's like.
Yes, I have been there. And I will discourage people from visiting because it is on private property. But we have been allowed to go out there and cover stories there a couple of times. Its history fascinates me because I wanted to find out, when did this ghost story start? The idea behind the Devil's Tramping Ground, for those who don't know, is it's a circle of earth in the middle of the woods where nothing grows. And nothing has been able to grow there, as far as we can tell, hundreds of years, further back than recorded history, or at least recorded European history. Nothing has grown on this spot. And if you go out there, you'll see there are trees and woods and grass and stuff everywhere. And then there's just this circle, this gray circle of dirt. And there's no real explanation for it. According to legend, the reason nothing grows there is, this is the lore behind it that I think European settlers created, which is that the devil paces there when he's, plotting and planning, right? He paces around this circle, and therefore he's kind of singed away its life and its ability to grow anything. According to legend, if you camp in the circle, you will wake up moved outside the circle mysteriously by an invisible force in the night.
Do you know the owners? I mean, are they a little bit creeped out by this, or did they like it? Did they think it's interesting?
I'm not sure what the owners think of it. I think mostly they are concerned about people visiting it a lot, because people do like to come there and camp out. And of course, they're not supposed to without permission. And more of a problem, there's trash there. The people
Oh,
leave
yeah,
trash around.
I
So
could see that. Okay, so tell me about buried treasure in Cary. That I have not heard that one. Tell me about that one.
yeah, so that one is fascinating to me as well. So this is where history really comes in, right? According to an actual primary historical source, there were haunted woods in Cary. Now there was a family that lived in the High House. It was a house that was called the High House because it was up on a hill and it was 2 stories tall. So people just said, that's the High House over there. Now, High House Road is named after that house. Historians today don't exactly know where that house once stood because it was torn down in the early 1900s. We're not exactly sure. We have a general idea. But what we do know is that documents written back in that era from families that lived in that house, a couple of weird things happened out there. One, a woman who lived in that area went out into the woods, and of course, it was a lot more wooded out back then in Cary, went out into the woods and was missing. And when they found her, they said it seemed as though she was possessed and she just kept talking nonsense and was just petrified by what had happened to her in those woods. And they were never able to totally make sense of it. So they did believe that those woods were haunted or at least creepy. You wouldn't want to go out there alone. Well, the owner of the home, one night, he had a dream that there was buried treasure. Now, this was very common to bury treasure around the Civil War, right? Because if Union soldiers were coming through Cary, which they did, people were afraid the Union soldiers would take their treasures. And
So you would hide it, right?
You would hide it. So he had a dream that the person before him had hidden buried treasure in the fireplace. And so he woke up from the middle of the night, like 3 a.m, and ran to the fireplace and started to dig. But when he got there, someone had already dug up the fireplace in his house in the middle of the night. And so there's this legend that the buried treasure could still be out there on that land. For many years, people who lived in Cary a long time ago remember that even though the house was gone, the chimney was still standing out in those woods. And there was a legend that there could be buried treasure out by that chimney. But now there's no more markers, so we don't know where that buried treasure would be. But it might
It could be under somebody's house.
It could be near someone. It could be under someone's house. You're right.
Could be in your backyard, under your deck, under your swimming pool. Who knows?
Yep.
So you. I think both of us have an interest in this. Tell me, have you ever been scared covering any of these stories? I mean, going to these locations?
Not scared, but I will tell you, the Eno River has, a lot of people don't realize, off those hiking trails around the Eno, there are hidden cemeteries. Because the Eno River used to be a community where people there were mills, there were cemeteries, and there was a schoolhouse. So when you go hiking down those trails, there's ruins and remnants all out in those woods if you know where to look. And there's a cemetery referred to as the Cabelands Cemetery in those woods. And I had heard from a friend of mine who went out and found it that when he was there, he saw shadows moving around out the corner of his eye while he was out there trying to do his work.
So you had to go check it out.
Yes, so I had to go check it out, and I was, of course, alone. And I had something, just for fun, I had something that would basically record electronic voice noises. So I was trying to see if I could pick up any voices, and I heard someone screaming. It didn't sound like a horror movie scream. It sounded like almost not quite an animal, but not quite a human. It was this very strange shriek that I heard in my recording. And then I also heard somebody come over the static on the recording, and they said, "Hello?" And
wow.
So I caught these weird voices out there, and being alone and knowing that someone had seen shadows walking around, I was a little nervous.
Creepy.
Yeah.
I have a ghost story, Heather, that I'll tell you off the air that happened to me in New Orleans one time. So I think everybody has something like that, And we see these shows where researchers actually document this, and that's kind of what you're talking about, where you have this sound machine where you can hear a frequency that we couldn't hear with our ears, or you take a picture and then something shows up in the photograph. It's really fascinating stuff. So would you spend the night in a haunted house?
Oh, I totally would. So this year, I've already picked out my 4 places that I'm going. I go to one place each weekend. But there are several haunted hotels and Airbnbs. I did a story on it last year. And I would like to, maybe next year, make one of my stories staying overnight in one of these haunted hotels and telling
Okay,
the story.
well, I am in. So we're going to do this together. Let me know, because I've always wanted to do that, but I'm not doing it alone for sure. So tell me, if our listeners want to learn more about some of the places that you are documenting, where can they find it?
Yeah, so if you want to see these stories, I'm visiting 4 places that are haunted this month. And then, of course, there's hidden history, for years. So you can go to WRAL.com and just search hidden history. And these stories will be right at the top. I would definitely recommend it because some of the places I visit, you can visit too. So if you're looking for a spooky road trip, there'll be some ideas in here for you.
Thank you so much, Heather, for sharing your insight. This has just been fascinating and so much fun for me. And thank you for listening to the WRAL Daily Download. If you'd like to hear more about things to do and places to visit and restaurants to enjoy in North Carolina, check out WRAL Out and About, a weekly podcast from WRAL News. Find WRAL Out and About in your podcast app.